I do everything, yes.
You posed the question of examining the second death dying experience of Christ on the cross. Could you follow that through and try to please?
Well, I want to know several questions about the death that is the result or the penalty of sin, whatever word you want to use. Now, there are statements in Scripture that one can use, but it is significant that the Bible consists of very few statements. Most of the Bible is made up of a history, a description of events, and most particularly a description of the setting within which certain events occurred. Now, I cannot understand the events unless I can understand the setting. I don't know why God would choose to so speak or so act, for example, thundering from Sinai, but weeping on the Mount of Olives, unless I have the setting. So I'm not surprised to find that the Bible consists largely of a description of the setting, and it all becomes very important to me. Then when God speaks or acts as he may choose to do on each occasion, I then ask God, what are you trying to say? What are you revealing about yourself? When God allows the psalmist to say in the second psalm, God's anger is quickly kindled, and yet I read elsewhere, the Lord is slow to wrath, I've got to recreate the setting, haven't I? When the psalmist says, it is my grief that the right hand of the Most High has changed, and then I read, but God changes not. And then when I read, take the tithe and buy strong drink with it and rejoice before the Lord. If you have any left, give it to the poor, that they may forget their misery. Putting two verses together from Deuteronomy and Proverbs. Then I indeed need to recreate the setting, you see. Without the setting, we're lost. And because people won't read the total setting, they only pick those pieces that fit their already preconceived opinions. That's the here a little, there a little method, which is very hazardous. And you have 200 or 300 churches in the United States, each with their own collection of littles. But we say we got the best littles. No, I say away with the here a little and there a little. Let's take the Bible as a whole. As I read through the Bible as a whole, I do notice God's method. It is a method of demonstration, of explanation. Why necessary? Because he's been accused. If he'd not been accused, page 1 in the Bible, there would have been no need for God to defend himself. But I notice immediately that God does not defend with denial. He doesn't say the devil is lying. He's wrong. I'm right. How could I choose? Because the devil says, no, I'm right. He's wrong. How do you settle it? Well, God says, I'm bigger than you are. Well, did that make Russia right and Hungary wrong? We know that doesn't work. If God had exercised his power that way, the devil would have used it to support his contention that God seeks to establish right by force. God's method is the method of explanation, the accumulation of evidence, and that's what makes him so believable. Then when he says, trust me, I say, God, your very method is what makes you trustworthy. You haven't demanded trust without obedience. That bumper sticker is an insult to God. Sweet for little children. That's why I say, put it on your tricycle if you wish, but peel it off your car. I'm scared to have you on the road if you've still got that on your automobile. So then I come to the ultimate question. The first charge in the Bible was that God has lied about death being the result of sin. That's the very first charge, isn't it? And God is pictured there as selfish and vengeful and arbitrary and exacting, right there in the Garden of Eden. Now later on, when I get to the 66th book, I realize that Satan had made those charges back in heaven before. You don't know that in Genesis. When you get to Revelation, a book that Luther couldn't use, we get the larger picture that's all started up in heaven, that God is vengeful, unforgiving, and severe. For God had spoken of law and of death to the angels, and the devil made the worst of all of that. Then he introduces it to the human race. So I want to know about this death. Is it true that God has demanded obedience under penalty of death? And then I read on that obedience is to love. And I say, how can you demand love under threat of execution? That just denies everything that makes sense to me. And then someone will say, well, but who are you to question God's inscrutable way? He doesn't have to make sense. And I say, if he doesn't have to make sense, then I don't have to trust him. I couldn't. I'm not going to trust in the dark. And then somebody gets up and says, well, faith is a leap in the dark anyway. It's pure nonsense, the whole thing. Whereas the truth is called light. It's supposed to make sense and not be too complicated. So I ask, God, I have every reason to trust you when you say the wages of sin is death. tell me about that death. And as I read, and Ellen White is so true to Scripture in all of this, had God simply left Satan and his followers and Adam and Eve and all the rest of us to reap the natural results of our sin, described in the Bible as a breach of trust, of lawlessness, of rebelliousness, of an unwillingness to listen. Had God left us to reap the natural results, we would have died. But the universe looking on would be puzzled. Is the devil right that God is killing off his children who don't trust and obey him? How could I ever find out? Well, did God ask us to prove the truthfulness of his word, that the wages of sin is death? He could have, if he'd let us all die. He could have said to the devil, any more questions? They're all dead, and you're next. And then he'd turn to the loyal ones and say, any questions about death being the result of sin? No, it obviously is, but God, tell us, did you do it? Did you do it? Because the devil says he does it. And if God does it, we are obligated to love God under threat of execution. And does that appeal to you at all? Well, there we go. Who are you to question God's inscrutable ways? It doesn't have to make sense anyway. I say it does have to make sense. If the meaning of the death of Christ doesn't make sense, it has no meaning. And it's a waste. Nothing was meant to make more sense than the way Jesus died. So I go to the cross to watch somebody die. God did not ask us to prove the truthfulness of his word. In the fullness of time, he came himself. God, in human form, died that awful death. And you watch him die. And you watch the Father while the Son dies. What is the Father doing to the Son? Is he torturing the Son? Is he executing his Son? Either in Gethsemane or on the cross. Tell me, did he ever lay a hand on the Son? Give me a text that he laid a hand on the Son. There's separation there, which is mentioned many times in Scripture as the natural result of our rebelliously turning away from God. And you remember all the places we've so often discussed in Hosea. Israel is bent on leaving me. I must let them go. And God cries as he lets them go. And you put all of Scripture together, and you see indeed that death is the result of sin, but it is not torture and execution at the hands of our gracious God. Now, I'm speaking as an Adventist when I say that. Mr. Martin would say, but it is not torture at the hands of our gracious God, except he would say it is. You see, to Mr. Martin and most of the Christian world, the wages of sin is torture for eternity. We say, no, only as long as you deserve. Is there a third version? And I think it's crucial because if you believe that God is the torturer and the executioner, then what is the purpose of the plan of salvation? Is it not somehow to make it possible for God to forgive me so he won't have to torture me to death? But if the good news is not, there is a way provided so God won't have to torture you to death. The good news is rather, he wasn't going to torture you to death in the first place.
No, but they would say that the good news is that he provided somebody else that was perfect that they killed to meet the requirement of the law.
Yet, can you see at this point how one's understanding of the second death colors one's whole understanding of the plan of salvation? Can you see how in the model where God is the destroyer and the torturer, justification is the adjustment of your legal standing? Because if your legal standing is not adjusted, God will have to torture you as long as you deserve, even in the Adventist model. But if God is not the one who tortures and executes, justification is not so much the adjustment of your legal standing, it's being set right with God, put right with God, restored to a right relationship with God, being brought back to a posture of humble willingness to listen and trust so that God can heal the damage done. Tell me, does forgiveness keep us from dying? In the legal model, yes. In the other model, no. You can die forgiven. Does forgiveness keep a smoker from dying? If the death is the natural result of our sinful, untrusting, rebellious rejection of God, forgiveness will not keep us from dying. We need to be healed, and the word salvation means healing, not forgiving. See, will heaven be peopled with pardoned criminals or with people who've been changed? There's a real difference, and this is the view that is up for discussion these days.
Christ didn't meet the requirements of the law on the cross, then what did he do?
What is the requirement of the law?
Well, the requirement of the law is that the sinner will die. And Christ met the requirements of the law on the cross so the sinner could get into heaven.
See how you have to define every word and every phrase, and that's where we ended last week. I think we need to take every one of these names and phrases in our theology and see if we can agree on what they mean. Someone asked you, do you believe in the vicarious, substitutionary, atoning death of Christ? Now, those are great words, but I tell you, they mean all kinds of things. All kinds of things.
Be answered in the meeting at the general conference in September rather
Exciting,
than some
wouldn't
of
it?
the other questions.
Would be exciting. Yes.
What do you mean when you say, or when Sister White says, that the cross shows the immutability of God's
Oh,
law?
indeed.
All right, then what about the law? If you look at the cross, and the law was there before the cross is the fruit of the law. So the law was there long before there was ever a cross. Then what's
That's getting
it all
complicated,
about?
isn't it?
What did Christ do on the cross? That's the question.
Yes.
You'd
What did he
never
do?
have a cross if there hadn't been a law.
What do you think?
A little better idea to give you to chew on. Did the universe know that Christ was dying from sin in the Garden of Gethsemane? And if they did so, what would have happened if Christ had died in Gethsemane and never gone to the cross?
Oh, I think that's a very fair question.
No, he could have died there.
Well, one man's careful analysis is another person's speculation. It depends on one's view, you see, here. I will honor his comments as a serious inquiry. The universe watched Jesus falling, dying to the ground in Gethsemane. And an angel was sent from heaven to strengthen him. Why? To prolong the torment, or because something more needed to be said? Now, in the scheme of things, as some of us understand it, when a teacher ever turns to the board and says, now there are 3 thus and so's, I always try to think of 4 or 5, so be suspicious when I say 3. In my mind, there are 3 very vital questions in this connection. In the great controversy, starting with Genesis, is it true that the wages of sin is death? The devil says that's a lie, so it's got to be answered. Next question. But who does the killing, the executing, the torturing? Because if God does it, God has demanded love under threat of torture and execution. And I think we should be very candid with these words. This appropriate length of suffering in the fire, if it is not to affect or discipline you in any way, is pure vengeance and torture, because you die at the end. The state of California would not permit it. Now, there are some who would like to have taken Manson out and slowly tortured him to death. The state of California will not permit it. We try to find the quickest way to put a person to death. They didn't even put him to death. Extraordinary. That's because we're soft. God is not soft, some would say. You can count on him. What will God do? So I have a question. But is this death, is it going to be torture and execution at the hands of God? Now the devil says, yes, but since you're immortal, it will be endless torture. And he has capitalized on that and won millions of people to his side on the basis of a teaching which many of us believe in. How do you stand with or against the devil on this issue? Does it help to say, but you won't be tortured longer than you deserve? Does that help? Now, the next question, which I think is the most subtle one of all, and if Ellen White hadn't commented on a great deal, I would not have seen it yet. What's wrong with God putting sinners to death? What's wrong with it? The almighty infinite one, the sovereign of the universe. Why can't he say, if you disobey me, I will in all love and justice put you to death in an appropriate manner? And Ellen White's comment is, that would produce fear, and the obedience that springs from fear produces the character of a rebel. And that if God had allowed the wicked to die without explanation in due course, as provided by the death of his Son, there was danger the universe would serve him from fear, and he would actually turn the universe against him. Now, there are many who see nothing wrong in the obedience that springs from fear, because that's the way they'd run the universe themselves. That's the way they come across all the time. That's the bent of their personality. They see nothing wrong with this. That's their problem. But to some of us, that God at such infinite cost would make it plain, yes, death is the result of sin, but it is not torture and execution at his gracious hands, for he does not want the obedience that springs from fear. He doesn't want it at all. That says something about God. The truth, plus what he paid to make that truth clear, is the most convincing evidence that God can be trusted and we will be comfortable with him for all eternity. And indeed, he values nothing higher than our freedom, which is the ultimate good news. Now, I would maintain that the Christian world, by and large, still is tainted with the devil's picture of God. Now, that doesn't mean that everyone that holds that view is lost, because at the foot of Sinai, the people served God from fear. But it was a good first step. Many children serve their parents from fear, and if that keeps Johnny from playing on the street, that's a good thing. It'll keep him from dying. But that's for children, like the bumper sticker. God is waiting for grown-ups like Job in these last days, who have come to the place where they no longer are scared of God, but are more eager to do his will than they ever were before, without fear. Perfect love casts out all fear. There is no fear in love, John says, the one who wrote the book of Revelation, and perhaps knew more about the great controversy than any other Bible writer. So I believe that the death of Christ in Gethsemane and on Calvary answered all three questions, because Jesus was tortured. By whom? By people who were Seventh-day Adventists because of fear. They were the ones most like us in all history. You just look at the people who tortured Christ, mocked him, turned down his picture of God, and then rushed home for Seventh-day Sabbath. In their stomachs, nothing forbidden, their tithe paid up, everything was right in their lives. Those were blueprinters that hated, rejected, tortured, and murdered Christ. And Ellen White said at the Minneapolis General Conference, when this whole subject of whether or not God destroys the wicked came up, along with the subject of his law, she says, many of the delegates present at this meeting would reject Christ just as the unbelievers did in the first century. See, we can do the same thing, and I think it's happening again right now. In this present discussion that's going on, it's not an argument over which compartment the Lord went up to and all those other things and the year-day principle. Those are relatively side issues. At the heart of it is the age-old question, what kind of a person is our God? One group is preoccupied with its legal standing with God, and the other group is saying, no, the truth is bigger than that. That's where the issue is right now. I wish we were discussing it on that level. Well, we have one more time to do this. Yes, now we've got to go.
When you say that those at the foot of Sinai were there out of fear,
Yes.
and that was a good first step, I would respectfully raise the question that if I look at the history of what happened to those that were there out of fear and what they did periodically all the way down through the record,
It didn't hold.
It didn't hold, and I would say that there were some there that were not there out of fear and that understood what was going on, and that those were the ones that get saved out of that relationship there, and probably the ones that were there out of fear ultimately get lost unless they change their mind about what they thought about God when they were there out of fear.
If the fear led them to be quiet for the first time in their lives and hear God say, I don't want you to be afraid, all would be well. But sometimes you have to terrify people before you can tell them there is no need to be scared.
The record is that's not what happened.
Well, some heard, but at least one thing for sure, there was one man standing at the foot of the cross who said, there is no need to be scared. You remember? Moses stood there and said to the people, see, they said, don't let God speak to us lest we die. And Moses said, there is no need to be afraid. And it does say of Moses, he was God's friend, to whom God could talk face to face. So at least there was one. And I would judge there were some others, that they don't get much publicity there.